So, when you think of World War I, what comes to mind? Probably the muddy trenches of the Western Front, right? But what if I told you that thousands of miles away, in the heart of Africa, a completely different and just unbelievably brutal war was being fought? It's a war that's been almost totally forgotten, and it leaves us with this incredible puzzle.
And that brings us to the central question of this whole story. How on earth did a tiny force, fewer than 3,000 soldiers, manage to fight an empire of 250,000 to a standstill for 4 whole years? This is a true David versus Goliath situation. And the answer? Well, it's way more complex and fascinating than you'd ever guess.
Just look at these numbers. The mismatch is, well, it's staggering. On one side, you've got the German Schutztruppe, which was their colonial protection force. It was made up of maybe a couple hundred German officers and about 2,500 incredibly well-trained local African soldiers called askari. And on the other side, the Allies, who eventually threw more than 250,000 troops into this fight. The odds were, they were impossible.
So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to unpack just how this tiny force managed to survive, what their completely unorthodox strategy was, and we're also going to uncover the devastating and often hidden cost of this 4-year war.
All right, so the whole German campaign, it was pretty much the brainchild of one guy, Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. This man was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he understood something fundamental right from the start. He absolutely could not win. He wasn't going to conquer territory, and there was no way he could defeat the Allied armies. So he came up with a totally different plan.
So what does he do? He decides to fight a guerrilla war. Forget front lines, forget big, decisive battles. His army was going to become a ghost, always moving, striking when least expected, and then just vanishing back into the massive African interior. The goal wasn't to hold any ground. It was to lead the enemy on a miserable, endless, and exhausting chase.
And this right here was the whole point of his strategy. This was the master plan. Lettow-Vorbeck had one single goal: be the biggest pain in the neck he possibly could. He wanted to force the British Empire to pour enormous amounts of money, shipping, and soldiers into Africa, resources that they desperately needed on the Western Front. See, he wasn't trying to win the war in Africa. He was playing a different game. He was trying to make the Allies bleed resources from half a world away.
Okay, so what did that actually look like on the ground? Well, it turned into one of the longest and, frankly, weirdest pursuits in all of military history.
For 4 straight years, these guys were just constantly on the move. When they get pushed out of German East Africa, do they surrender? Nope. They just walk into neighboring Mozambique, which was a Portuguese colony. They spent 9 months there, living off whatever they could capture, before turning again and marching into what's now Zambia. They were a phantom army, pulling tens of thousands of Allied soldiers deeper and deeper into a total logistical nightmare.
Survival for them became a kind of art form. The Schutztruppe lived almost completely off of what they could steal from Allied and Portuguese bases. And get this, in this amazing feat of engineering, they actually salvaged these huge naval guns from a German cruiser they had to sink and then drag them for hundreds of miles through the bush. But, and this is a huge but, this survival came at a terrible price. It was all sustained by ruthlessly exploiting the local African populations, forcing them to carry supplies and just taking their food. And that decision would have absolutely catastrophic consequences.
And this is where the story, which might sound like some grand military adventure, takes a really, really dark turn. Because the real price of this war, it wasn't paid by the soldiers in uniform. It was paid by the people whose lands this all happened on.
Get ready for this number: 600,000. That's the estimated number of African porters or carriers that the British Empire forced into service to support its armies. There are hardly any roads or railways, so nearly everything, food, bullets, medical gear, had to be carried on the heads and backs of men.
And of those men, an estimated 95,000 of them died. They didn't die in combat. They died from disease, from pure exhaustion, from malnutrition. Let me put that in perspective for you. Their death rate was significantly higher than soldiers fighting in the trenches on the Western Front. They were the engine that made the war run, and they were treated as if they were completely disposable.
And if you want to know what the official attitude was at the time, just listen to this quote from a British Colonial Office official. It is absolutely chilling. It just perfectly captures the cold, callous indifference at the very heart of this colonial war. The suffering was unbelievable, but it was also invisible to the people in charge. It was just the cost of doing business.
Okay, look at this chart. If you take away one thing about the human cost, let it be this: the military casualties for both the Allies and the Germans. They're significant, sure,
But then you look at the deaths of non-combatants, and it just completely dwarfs them. When you add in the hundreds of thousands of civilians who died from famines the war caused, the true scale of the tragedy just snaps into focus. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a catastrophe for the people of East Africa.
So, how does a war like this devastating 4-year chase, finally end? Well, the ending itself got wrapped up in this really powerful myth. A myth that would shape how Germany saw the war for decades to come.
All right, so the war in Europe officially ends on November 11th. But Lettow-Vorbeck and his guys, they're so deep in the bush, so completely cut off from the world, they have no idea. They actually find out the war is over from a British messenger on a motorcycle that they captured. Can you imagine that? They finally lay down their weapons on November 25th, the very last German unit to surrender in World War I.
But the way this story was told back in Germany, that's the key to its whole legacy. In a Germany that felt defeated and humiliated, Lettow-Vorbeck was treated like a national hero. The legend that sprung up was that his army was undefeated in the field, a heroic, unbeaten force. They even gave him a victory parade through Berlin. The reality? Well, it was a lot messier. They accepted an unconditional surrender. And that whole celebrated military campaign, it was directly responsible for a staggering loss of African life. A fact that was, let's say, conveniently left out of the hero story. So you might be sitting there thinking, okay, that's a wild story, but it's an obscure campaign from over 100 years ago. Why does it still matter today? What can we possibly learn from this forgotten war?
Well, for one, it completely shatters the idea that World War I was just a European war. This was a world war, in the truest sense. But I think most importantly, it forces us to look at the massive hidden human cost of these colonial wars, a cost paid almost entirely by African people whose stories were just ignored. And finally, it's just this incredible, stark reminder of how history gets written and rewritten. The story of the undefeated army in Africa isn't just about the past. It's about the stories we choose to tell ourselves, and more importantly, the ones we choose to forget.